I never thought I'd become the center of a neighborhood war. It all started 3 months ago when I moved into Sycamore Heights, a quiet suburban community with pristine lawns and matching mailboxes. The houses were beautiful, the streets clean, and the neighborhood seemed perfect, at least until I met Veronica Winters, the president of our homeowners association. My first encounter with her happened just 2 days after I moved in. I was walking my golden retriever Max when a silver Mercedes pulled up beside us. The window rolled down to reveal a woman in her 50s with immaculately styled blonde hair and oversized sunglasses. "Excuse me," she said, her voice sharp as a knife. "Are you the new resident at 424 Maple Drive?" I nodded, offering a friendly smile. "Yes, I'm Oliver Bennett. Just moved in this weekend." Her eyes narrowed as she looked at Max, who was sitting obediently at my feet. "I don't recall seeing any pet applications in your home ownership paperwork. Dogs over 20 pounds are strictly regulated in Sycamore Heights." "Oh, I wasn't aware," I replied, feeling my stomach tighten. The real estate agent didn't mention anything about pet restrictions. "Ignorance of the rules doesn't exempt you from following them," she snapped, pulling out her phone. She took several photos of Max, who wagged his tail, oblivious to the brewing storm. "You'll be receiving a formal notice. There's a $250 fine for unauthorized pets, and you'll need to submit the proper documentation immediately." Before I could respond, she drove away, leaving me standing on the sidewalk, stunned and confused. Max nudged my hand with his nose, as if sensing my distress. I scratched behind his ears, trying to process what had just happened. "Don't worry, buddy," I whispered. "We're not going anywhere." That evening, I found a bright yellow envelope stuck to my front door. Inside was a formal warning notice from the Sycamore Heights HOA, listing my violation as unauthorized animal presence, with a $250 fine due within 7 days. There was also a multi-page application for pet approval that required everything from vaccination records to a behavior assessment and even a photograph of the animal posed beside a measuring tape. I couldn't believe the invasiveness of it all. Max had been my loyal companion for 6 years. He was gentle, well-trained, and had never caused any trouble. The thought of having to justify his existence to this woman made my blood boil. The next morning, I called my Uncle James. We had always been close, and he had actually been the one who suggested I look into Sycamore Heights when I got my new job in the city. Uncle James had worked for the county for over 20 years and was now the head of animal control. He had a calm way of handling difficult situations, which was exactly what I needed. "Ollie, slow down," he said after I spent 5 minutes ranting about Veronica and her ridiculous rules. What exactly did the notice say? I read him the entire document, including the fine print about the HOA's right to enforce removal of unauthorized animals from the premises. "They can't make me get rid of Max, can they?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. The idea of losing my dog was unthinkable. Uncle James was quiet for a moment. "No, they can't forcibly remove a pet like that. But HOAs do have significant power through their covenants. Let me look into the specific HOA's bylaws. In the meantime, gather all of Max's documents, vaccination records, license, microchip information, everything. And don't pay that fine yet." After hanging up, I spent the evening organizing Max's paperwork. He had always been properly registered with the county, was up to date on all vaccinations, and even had completed obedience training. As I sorted through the documents, I heard a knock at my door. My neighbor, an elderly man named Walter, stood on my doorstep with a plate of cookies. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said with a warm smile. "Thought you might like some homemade treats." "Thank you," I replied, genuinely touched by the gesture. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" Walter accepted, and as we sat in my kitchen, Max rested his head on Walter's knee, earning gentle scratches behind the ears. "I see you've already met our HOA president," Walter said, nodding toward the yellow notice I had left on the counter. I sighed. "Is she always so tyrannical?" Walter finished with a sad chuckle. Veronica has been getting worse since she was elected president 3 years ago. Used to be a reasonable woman until her husband left. Now she seems to think controlling every aspect of our lives will somehow bring order to hers." Walter went on to share his own stories. He had been fined for having bird feeders that were not aesthetically consistent with neighborhood standards. Another neighbor, a single mother named Diane, had received warnings about her children's bicycles being visible in her driveway. "Most of us just pay the fines," Walter explained. "It's easier than fighting her. Veronica's brother-in-law is a lawyer, and she's not afraid to threaten legal action." As Walter left, he squeezed my shoulder. "Don't let her bully you, son. This neighborhood needs someone to stand up to her." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Walter and the other neighbors living under Veronica's thumb. I thought about Max, who was peacefully snoring at the foot of my bed, unaware that his very presence was causing such drama. And I thought about the unfairness of it all, how one person could wield so much power over so many lives. The next morning, I walked Max early, hoping to avoid another confrontation. But as we rounded the corner back to my house, Veronica was waiting, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Bennett," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "I notice you still have the dog, despite the notice." "His name is Max," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "And, yes, he's still with me, because he's my legal pet, properly licensed with the county." Veronica's smile tightened. "The county's rules are irrelevant here. Sycamore Heights has its own regulations, which you agreed to when you purchased your property. The fine has now doubled to $500 due to your non-compliance, and if the animal remains without proper HOA approval by Friday, it will increase to $1,000. As she spoke, she snapped more photos of Max and me. "Documentation of continuing violations," she explained with a smirk before walking away. I stood there, my hands shaking with anger. Max pressed against my leg, his warm presence a reminder of what I was fighting for. In that moment, I made a decision. I wasn't just going to fight for my right to keep Max, I was going to challenge Veronica's entire reign of terror. Little did she know that the quiet new neighbor she had chosen to intimidate had resources she couldn't begin to imagine, and I was about to use every single one of them. The next day, I received another envelope, this one bright red with "Final Warning" stamped across the front. Inside was a notice stating that the HOA board would be meeting in 1 week to discuss animal violations and potential removal actions. My hands trembled as I read the thinly veiled threat. They were actually suggesting they could force me to get rid of Max. I immediately called Uncle James, who answered on the second ring. "They can't do this," I said, my voice cracking. "They can't take Max away from me." "Take a deep breath, Ollie," Uncle James said calmly. "I've been looking into your HOA bylaws, and there's something interesting here. Their pet regulations haven't been updated in over a decade, and they don't actually align with current county ordinances." "What does that mean?" I asked, watching Max as he dozed peacefully in the patch of sunlight by the window, completely unaware of the battle being fought over him. "It means we have grounds to challenge them," Uncle James explained. "But I think we need to do more than just defend your right to keep Max. From what you've told me, this Veronica woman has been terrorizing the entire neighborhood. It might be time for someone to stand up to her." After hanging up, I sat at my kitchen table and made a plan. Uncle James had advised me to talk to more neighbors and collect evidence of other unfair treatment. If we could show a pattern of harassment and selective enforcement, we'd have a stronger case. That afternoon, I went door to door introducing myself to my neighbors. Many were hesitant at first, clearly afraid of Veronica's retaliation. But once they realized I was serious about challenging the HOA leadership, stories poured out. Diana Rodriguez, the single mother Walter had mentioned, invited me in for lemonade and showed me a folder thick with violation notices, most of them regarding her children's toys being visible in the yard or driveway. "I work 2 jobs," Diana explained as her 2 young daughters played quietly in the corner of the living room. I don't have time to constantly police where every toy ends up. Last month, she fined me $300 because my daughter's bicycle was visible from the street for more than 3 hours. 3 hours! She actually timed it and took photos every 30 minutes to prove it. Down the street, an older couple named Bernard and Martha showed me the certified letter they'd received threatening legal action because their garden gnome collection was too numerous and not in keeping with the aesthetic standards of the community. "We've lived here for 30 years, Martha said, her voice quivering with emotion. These gnomes were gifts from our grandchildren. Each one represents a special memory. By the end of the day, I had visited 15 houses and heard a dozen similar stories. More importantly, several neighbors had agreed to attend the upcoming HOA meeting to support me. That evening, as I sat sorting through the copies of violation notices my neighbors had shared with me, there was another knock at my door. This time, it was a middle-aged woman I hadn't met yet. "Hi, I'm Carla Thornton," she said nervously, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid of being seen. "I live at 417 across the street. I heard you're taking on Veronica." I invited her in, and Carla hesitated before stepping inside. Max immediately approached her, wagging his tail in greeting. "He's beautiful," she said, kneeling to pet him. "I had to give my beagle away last year. Veronica claimed he was barking excessively and disturbing the neighborhood. I never received a single complaint from any actual neighbors, but she had documentation of the barking." Tears welled in Carla's eyes. "I couldn't fight her. I was going through a divorce and I just didn't have the energy. So I sent Baxter to live with my sister in Oregon. I haven't seen him in 8 months." My heart ached for Carla, and my resolve strengthened. This wasn't just about Max anymore. It was about standing up to a bully who had been allowed to run unchecked for too long. "I'm sorry about Baxter," I said, placing a hand on her shoulder, "but maybe we can make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Carla wiped her eyes and straightened her shoulders. "That's why I'm here. I want to help. I used to be an administrative assistant before I retired. I'm good with organization and paperwork." Together, Carla and I spent the next few days preparing for the HOA meeting. She helped me create a presentation board displaying all the collected violation notices, organized by type and severity. We highlighted the inconsistencies in enforcement and the outdated bylaws that contradicted county regulations. Uncle James stopped by on Wednesday evening, bringing pizza and official documentation about the county's pet regulations. "The HOA can have additional rules," he explained as we spread papers across my dining room table. "But they can't contradict county ordinances, and they have to be enforced consistently. From what I can see, Veronica has been making up rules as she goes along." The night before the meeting, I could barely sleep. Max seemed to sense my anxiety and stayed close, his warm body pressed against mine, his steady breathing eventually lulling me into a restless slumber. Friday evening arrived, and I walked into the community center where the HOA meetings were held. The room was already packed. Word had spread about my challenge, and it seemed like half the neighborhood had turned out. I spotted Walter, Diana, Bernard, and Martha, and several other neighbors I'd spoken with over the past week. Carla sat in the front row, giving me a thumbs up as I entered. Veronica sat at the center of a long table at the front of the room, flanked by 4 other board members. Her eyes narrowed when she saw me walk in with Max on his leash. I had deliberately brought him, making sure he was groomed to perfection and wearing his therapy dog vest, another fact about Max that Veronica didn't know. "Mr. Bennett," she said into the microphone, her voice echoing through the room, "animals are not permitted at board meetings." I stepped forward, keeping my voice steady. According to the Americans with Disabilities Act, service and therapy animals are allowed in all public spaces. Max is a certified therapy dog who visits hospitals and nursing homes twice a month. I have his certification right here. I held up the laminated card that hung from Max's vest. Veronica's face flushed, but she quickly regained her composure. "We'll address your violation shortly. Please take a seat." The meeting began with standard HOA business. budget reports, upcoming maintenance projects, and a lengthy discussion about the color palette for exterior house paint. All the while, Veronica kept shooting glances at me, clearly eager to get to my case. Finally, after nearly an hour, she cleared her throat and announced, "Now we'll address the matter of 424 Maple Drive and the unauthorized animal." She proceeded to detail my violations with clinical precision, displaying the photos she'd taken of Max and me on a projector screen. "As you can see," she continued, "Mr. Bennett has repeatedly ignored our notices and continued to harbor this large animal without proper HOA approval." When she finished, she looked at me with a triumphant smile. "Do you have anything to say in your defense before the board votes on enforcement action?" I stood up, taking a deep breath. Max sat obediently at my feet as I walked to the front of the room. "Thank you, Ms. Winters, for bringing this matter to everyone's attention," I began, maintaining a polite tone despite the anger simmering inside me. "I'd like to address not only my situation but some broader concerns about how our HOA operates." Veronica's smile faltered as I set up the presentation board Carla and I had prepared. Whispers rippled through the audience as people saw the collection of violation notices. "Over the past week, I've had the pleasure of meeting many of my neighbors," I continued, "and I've discovered that my experience isn't unique. Many residents have been subjected to arbitrary enforcement of rules, excessive fines, and even threats of legal action for minor or non-existent violations." I gestured to the board. "Here are just some examples. Diana Rodriguez was fined because her children's bicycles were visible in her driveway. The Clarks received a notice because their holiday decorations remained up for 24 hours past the designated removal date, during a weekend when they were attending a funeral. Mrs. Thornton was forced to give up her beloved pet based on noise complaints that none of the adjacent neighbors ever made." The room grew tense as I continued, methodically addressing each case with the documentation we had collected. Several neighbors stood up to briefly share their own experiences, adding weight to my presentation. "But let's get back to my specific case," I said, pulling out Max's folder. "Max is a licensed, vaccinated, trained therapy dog who poses no threat to anyone. The HOA bylaws regarding pets have not been updated since 2011 and do not align with current county ordinances." I turned to face Veronica directly. "Ms. Winters, did you know that forcing a resident to remove a properly licensed pet without valid health or safety concerns actually violates County Code Section 718.3? Veronica's face paled slightly, but she quickly recovered. "Our HOA has the right to establish and enforce its own rules, Mr. Bennett. Your county regulations are irrelevant here." This was the moment I'd been waiting for. I smiled as the community center door opened and Uncle James walked in, wearing his official animal control uniform with the county emblem clearly visible on his chest. "Actually," I said, "I think we should hear from an expert on that. I'd like to introduce my uncle, James Wilson, who happens to be the head of animal control for the county." A murmur of surprise ran through the room. Veronica's mouth opened and closed wordlessly as Uncle James approached the front of the room. "Good evening," Uncle James said, his authoritative voice instantly commanding attention. "I've reviewed the HOA bylaws for Sycamore Heights, and I must inform you that several of your pet regulations directly contradict county ordinances, which take legal precedence. Furthermore, the harassment of homeowners regarding properly licensed and well-behaved animals could potentially be considered a violation of owner rights under state law." He placed a thick document on the table in front of Veronica. "This is a formal notice from the county regarding these discrepancies. You'll find that not only is Mr. Bennett's dog fully compliant with all legal requirements, but your attempts to force its removal could expose the HOA to significant liability." The room erupted in whispers and exclamations. Veronica's face had gone from pale to bright red. She frantically flipped through the pages Uncle James had provided, her hands shaking visibly. "This is outrageous," she sputtered. "You can't just come in here and—" "Oh, but he can," said a voice from the back of the room. Everyone turned to see a woman in a business suit walking down the aisle. Nancy Chen, County Commissioner, she introduced herself. James contacted my office about the situation here, and I must say, I'm concerned about what I'm hearing. My jaw dropped. Uncle James had mentioned reaching out to the county board, but I had no idea the commissioner herself would show up. Homeowners associations serve an important function in our communities, Commissioner Chen continued, addressing the entire room. But they must operate within the law and with transparency. From what I've seen here tonight, there appear to be serious issues with how this HOA has been managed. She turned to the board members beside Veronica. I'd recommend a full review of your bylaws and enforcement practices, conducted by an independent party. My office can provide resources to help with this process. One of the other board members, a middle-aged man who had been silent throughout the meeting, cleared his throat. I think that would be an excellent idea, Commissioner. In fact, I move that we table all current violation notices until such a review can be completed. Second, said another board member quickly, clearly sensing which way the wind was blowing. Veronica looked around in shock as her fellow board members nodded in agreement. But we can't just— All in favor? Asked the male board member, ignoring Veronica's stuttering protests. A chorus of ayes filled the room, not just from the board, but from virtually every homeowner present. Motion carried, the man announced, unable to hide a small smile of satisfaction. All current violation notices are suspended pending review. The meeting descended into chaos after that, people talking excitedly, several neighbors coming up to shake my hand or pat me on the back. Through it all, Max sat calmly at my feet, occasionally accepting a gentle pat from admiring neighbors. Veronica sat frozen in her chair, her carefully constructed kingdom crumbling around her. When our eyes met across the room, I didn't see anger in her gaze as I expected, but something that looked almost like fear. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. As the crowd began to disperse, Uncle James came over and gave me a hug. "You did good, Ollie," he said proudly. "You didn't just stand up for yourself and Max, you stood up for the whole community." On our walk home, several neighbors joined Max and me, the conversation flowing freely now that the weight of Veronica's reign had been lifted. Diana's daughters skipped ahead, occasionally stopping to pet Max or throw sticks for him to fetch. Walter walked beside me, moving more energetically than I'd seen before. "You know," Walter said thoughtfully, "we should organize a neighborhood barbecue. Get to know each other properly without all these ridiculous rules hanging over our heads." "That's a wonderful idea," Diana agreed. "My backyard is pretty big. We could host it there." "And I make a mean potato salad," Carla added with a smile. As we reached my house, the impromptu planning committee decided to meet the next day to organize the community's first-ever Freedom Barbecue. Everyone dispersed to their homes, spirits higher than they'd been in years. Inside, I gave Max an extra treat and sat beside him on the couch, scratching behind his ears just the way he liked. "We did it, buddy," I whispered. "We stood up to the big, bad HOA and won." Max thumped his tail against the couch cushions, looking up at me with those soulful eyes that seemed to understand everything. The next morning, I was surprised to find a small potted plant on my doorstep with a note attached. The handwriting was elegant and precise. "Mr. Bennett, I owe you an apology. After some reflection, I realize my behavior has been inexcusable. The loss of control in my personal life was no excuse to exert excessive control over others. I've submitted my resignation from the HOA board effective immediately. Your dog is beautiful. He reminds me of one I had as a child. Sincerely, Veronica Winters." I stood on my porch for a long moment, rereading the note with Max leaning against my leg. People were capable of change, it seemed, when forced to confront their own behavior. Later that day, as I helped Diana and Carla set up for the barbecue, Walter arrived with news that the remaining HOA board members had voted to completely overhaul the community guidelines, with input welcome from all residents. "They're talking about creating a community garden in that empty lot by the playground," Walter said excitedly, "and getting rid of at least half of those nitpicky rules about exterior decorations." As neighbors began to arrive for the barbecue, bringing dishes and drinks to share, I noticed a tentative figure hovering at the edge of Diana's yard. It was Veronica, looking uncomfortable but determined, holding a covered dish in her hands. Diana saw her too, and after a moment's hesitation, walked over to invite her in. I couldn't hear what was said, but after a brief conversation, Veronica followed Diana into the yard, where she was introduced to a group of neighbors who made space for her at their table. Max, wearing a festive bandana around his neck for the occasion, trotted over to investigate the newcomer. To everyone's surprise, Veronica knelt down and gently offered her hand for him to sniff, then began to pet him with genuine affection. "Well, would you look at that?" Uncle James said, appearing at my side with a plate of barbecue. "Sometimes the biggest bullies are just people who've forgotten how to connect." I nodded, watching as Veronica actually smiled when Max performed his trick of offering his paw to shake. Maybe she needed this as much as everyone else did. As the afternoon wore on, the atmosphere in Diana's backyard was one of genuine community. Children playing, adults chatting and laughing, neighbors who had lived beside each other for years finally getting to know one another as friends rather than just recipients of the same violation notices. Max made his rounds, accepting treats and affection from everyone, clearly enjoying his newfound celebrity status in the neighborhood. When he finally flopped down in the shade beside me, exhausted from all the attention, I couldn't help but smile at how one supposedly unauthorized animal had managed to transform an entire community. "You know," Walter said, settling into the chair next to mine with a glass of lemonade, "in all my years living here, I've never felt like I was part of something special until today." I looked around at the gathering. Diana teaching some of the older ladies her family's secret salsa recipe, Bernard showing the children how to make paper airplanes, Carla and Veronica deep in conversation about gardening, and felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer sun. "Sometimes," I replied, "it just takes one person willing to stand up and say, 'Enough,' to change everything." Walter raised his glass in a toast. "To standing up." "And to new beginnings," I added, clinking my glass against his. Max raised his head at the sound, his tail thumping against the grass in agreement. As far as new beginnings went, this one felt pretty perfect. 2 weeks after the barbecue, the transformation of Sycamore Heights was in full swing. The remaining HOA board members had established a community feedback committee to help rewrite the bylaws. To everyone's surprise, Carla volunteered to chair it, revealing that before retirement, she had worked not just as an administrative assistant, but in municipal code enforcement. "I know how these regulations should actually work," she explained during the first committee meeting, held in my backyard with Max serving as an unofficial mascot. "They're meant to protect property values and ensure safety, not to control every aspect of residents' lives." The committee meetings quickly became weekly social events, with neighbors bringing snacks and drinks as they worked through the tedious process of reviewing and rewriting rules. What could have been dry, bureaucratic work instead became an opportunity for people to share their vision for the community they wanted to live in. Diana's daughters, Emma and Lily, even got involved, offering crayon-drawn suggestions for the playground renovation that was now being discussed. Their innocent proposal for a dog park section where Max and other puppies can play received unanimous approval. "I can't believe how much has changed," Diana said to me one evening as we watched the girls playing fetch with Max in her backyard. "Last month, I was afraid to let them leave their bikes out. Now they're helping design community spaces." Walter had emerged as an unexpected leader in the neighborhood's transformation. His decades of living in Sycamore Heights gave him historical perspective that proved invaluable when questions arose about why certain rules existed in the first place. That restriction about exterior paint colors? That was added in 1992 after the Henderson family painted their house bright purple with yellow trim, he explained during one meeting, prompting laughter around the table. Maybe we don't need 16 pages of approved color swatches, but some basic guidelines aren't a terrible idea. As for me, I found myself becoming more integrated into the community than I ever expected. My initial plan had been to keep to myself while adjusting to my new job, but now I couldn't walk Max down the street without stopping for multiple conversations. Children wanted to pet Max, elderly neighbors invited us in for tea, and weekend cookouts became a regular occurrence. One particular Saturday morning, about a month after the confrontation at the HOA meeting, I was helping Bernard and Martha reinstall their beloved gnome collection, now officially permitted under the interim guidelines while the new rules were being developed. This one is from our grandson, Timothy, when he graduated college, Martha explained, carefully placing a gnome wearing a graduation cap beside their front walkway. And this one Lizzie gave us when her first baby was born. She pointed to a gnome holding a tiny bundle. As we worked, a silver Mercedes pulled up at the curb. Veronica stepped out, looking hesitant as she approached us. "Good morning," she said quietly. Since her resignation from the board, Veronica had kept a low profile in the neighborhood. She'd attended a few community events but generally hung back, clearly uncomfortable with her new position as just another resident rather than the authority figure she'd been for so long. "Veronica, come help us with these gnomes," Martha called out warmly, surprising me with her easy forgiveness. "You can tell us if we're arranging them tastefully enough." A flicker of shame crossed Veronica's face, but she managed a small smile as she came closer. "They look lovely, Martha. I always thought they were charming, actually." Martha raised an eyebrow. "You cited us 7 times for excessive lawn ornaments." Veronica flushed. "I know. The truth is, Robert always hated lawn decorations. My ex-husband," she clarified, glancing at me. "After he left, I think I just kept enforcing his preferences because it was the only way I knew how to maintain some sense of control." The raw honesty of her admission hung in the air for a moment before Martha simply handed her a gnome, fishing on a tiny lily pad. "Well, you can make up for it by helping us find the perfect spot for fishing Fred here." I watched in amazement as Veronica carefully considered several locations before placing the gnome beside a blue flower that resembled water. The transformation in her was as remarkable as the transformation in the neighborhood itself. While Veronica and Martha continued arranging gnomes, Bernard pulled me aside. "You know, Ollie, some of us are thinking about the annual HOA board elections coming up in September." "Already?" I asked, surprised. "It's only June." Bernard nodded, his eyes twinkling behind his glasses. "We like to plan ahead. Several of us think you should consider running for a position." I nearly dropped the gnome I was holding. "Me? I've only lived here a few months. Surely there are people with more experience." "Experience isn't what we need," Bernard interrupted gently. "We need someone who sees things clearly and isn't afraid to speak up when something's wrong. Someone who understands that rules should serve people, not the other way around." Before I could respond, Max came bounding around the corner of the house, followed by Diana's daughters who were giggling uncontrollably. Apparently, they had been trying to teach him a new trick involving spinning in circles. "We almost got it, Mr. Ollie," Emma called out. "He spun twice before getting dizzy." Max trotted over to me, tongue lolling happily, and then noticed Veronica. Without hesitation, he approached her, wagging his tail in greeting. Veronica knelt down, all focus on the gnomes forgotten as she stroked Max's golden fur. "You know," she said softly, "I had a golden retriever when I was a girl. Sonny was his name. My father gave him away when we moved to the city. I cried for weeks." The vulnerability in her voice made me see her in an entirely new light. The rigid HOA president had been a shell constructed around a wounded person, someone who had experienced her own losses and pains. "Max is a pretty good listener if you ever want to talk," I offered. "He visits the senior center twice a month as a therapy dog. The residents there say he has a way of making problems seem smaller." Veronica looked up, surprise and gratitude in her eyes. "I might take you up on that sometime." By lunchtime, Bernard and Martha's yard had been transformed into a whimsical garden of gnomes, each one placed with care and each with its own story. Several other neighbors had stopped by to help or simply to admire the work, and someone had ordered pizza for everyone. As we all sat on lawn chairs eating lunch, Walter raised his soda can in a toast. To the new Sycamore Heights, where gnomes are free and neighbors are friends. The following Wednesday evening, I arrived home from work to find an official-looking envelope in my mailbox. My heart skipped a beat, the memory of those yellow and red violation notices still fresh despite the weeks that had passed. But this envelope was white, with the county seal in the corner. Inside was a formal letter from Commissioner Chen's office informing me that based on my commitment to community welfare and advocacy, I was being invited to serve on a county-wide task force focused on establishing best practices for homeowners associations. The experiences you helped bring to light in Sycamore Heights suggest that similar issues may exist in other communities, the letter read. Your perspective would be valuable as we develop guidelines to ensure HOAs serve their intended purpose without overstepping reasonable boundaries. I sat on my front porch with Max beside me, reading the letter twice to make sure I understood. From new homeowner fighting for his dog to serving on a county task force, it was a journey I never could have anticipated. My phone buzzed with a text from Uncle James. Heard from Nancy C. about the task force. Proud of you, kiddo. You've turned one small stand into something that could help a lot of people. As the sun set over Sycamore Heights, I looked out at my neighborhood with a sense of wonder. Houses that had once seemed identical and impersonal now felt like homes where people I knew and cared about lived. The meticulous lawns and matching mailboxes remained, but they no longer seemed like symbols of rigid conformity. Just one aspect of a community where people were finding a balance between shared standards and personal expression. Down the street, I could see Diana's daughters riding their bicycles freely, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. Walter was watering his newly planted vegetable garden, which had been expressly permitted in the interim guidelines. And, at the end of the block, a group of neighbors was gathered around a set of architectural drawings for the proposed community garden. Max nudged my hand, his gentle reminder that it was time for our evening walk. As we set off down the sidewalk, neighbors called out greetings, children ran over for quick pets, and even Veronica, tending to roses in her front yard, offered a genuine smile and wave. You know, Max, I said quietly as we walked, sometimes standing up for what's right changes more than just your own situation. Sometimes it changes everything. Max looked up at me with those wise, gentle eyes that seemed to understand far more than any dog should, and I knew that our battle with the HOA had been worth every moment of stress and uncertainty. The summer continued to unfold with a series of community transformations. The first project to reach completion was the dog park section of the playground area, christened Max's Corner by Diana's daughters, a name that stuck despite my modest protests. The dedication ceremony featured homemade dog treats baked by Martha and a ribbon cutting where Max himself was given the honor of breaking ground by digging the first hole for a soon-to-be planted shade tree. By mid-July, the community garden was taking shape on what had once been an unused strip of land behind the community center. Weekend workdays brought together residents of all ages, digging beds, building raised planters for elderly gardeners, and installing a watering system. To everyone's surprise, Veronica proved to have extensive knowledge of native plants and efficient garden design. My mother was an avid gardener, she explained as she helped a group of children plant sunflower seeds. Before spreadsheets and rules, plants were my first love. Watching her patiently show Lily how to measure the proper depth for a seed, it was hard to reconcile this Veronica with the woman who had once threatened to take Max away from me. People could change, it seemed, when given the space and support to become better versions of themselves. The first meeting of the county HOA task force took place in August at the county administration building. I arrived early, nervously straightening my tie as I waited in the conference room. Commissioner Chen greeted me warmly, introducing me to the other task force members, 2 attorneys specializing in property law, a real estate developer, 3 HOA board members from other communities, and a representative from a homeowners' rights organization. We've asked you all here because you represent different perspectives on what HOAs should be and how they should function, Commissioner Chen explained once everyone was seated. Our goal is to develop a set of guidelines that protect property values while respecting individual rights and fostering community well-being. For the next 3 hours, we shared experiences and perspectives. Some of the other HOA board members were initially defensive, clearly seeing me as a threat to their authority. But as I shared the positive changes that had come from restructuring our approach in Sycamore Heights, their attitude gradually shifted. "You're not suggesting eliminating rules entirely," one woman said, sounding relieved. "Just making them more reasonable and focused on actual community needs, rather than control for its own sake." "Exactly," I agreed. "Our neighborhood looks just as good as it did before, better actually, because people are taking pride in their homes rather than living in fear of fines. The difference is that now there's a sense that we're all in this together rather than being policed by an external authority." By the end of the meeting, we had established a framework for our recommendations and scheduled monthly meetings to continue the work. As I drove home, I called Uncle James to update him. "That's fantastic, Ollie," he said proudly. "From fixing your own problem to helping shape policy. That's how real change happens." When I arrived home, there was an unfamiliar car in my driveway, a small blue hatchback that I didn't recognize. As I approached my front door, puzzled, it opened to reveal Carla with a finger to her lips. "Don't make a sound," she whispered. "Come see." She led me to my living room, where an extraordinary scene awaited. Veronica was sitting on my couch, and curled up beside her, head resting on her leg, was Max. Both were fast asleep, Veronica's hand still resting on Max's golden fur. "She came by to drop off some committee notes," Carla explained in a hushed voice. "She looked absolutely exhausted, said she hadn't been sleeping well. Max went right to her and put his head in her lap. 5 minutes later they were both out like lights. I didn't have the heart to wake them." A lump formed in my throat as I looked at the peaceful scene. "How long have they been asleep?" "About an hour," Carla replied. "I stayed because I didn't want her to wake up alone in a strange house and be embarrassed." I nodded, deeply moved by Carla's thoughtfulness and by the healing connection that had formed between my dog and my former adversary. "I'll make some tea. She might need it when she wakes up." We tiptoed to the kitchen, where Carla helped me prepare a tray of tea and the cookies Walter had dropped off that morning. As we worked quietly, Carla filled me in on the progress of the bylaws committee. "We finished the first draft," she said proudly. "It's about a quarter the length of the old rule book, focuses on the things that actually matter for safety and property values, and includes a formal process for residents to appeal decisions they feel are unfair." "That's incredible progress," I said, genuinely impressed. "You've all accomplished so much in such a short time." "We're motivated," Carla replied with a smile. "None of us wants to go back to the way things were before." A sound from the living room alerted us that Veronica was awake. When we entered with the tea tray, she was sitting up straight, looking disoriented and embarrassed, while Max continued to snooze beside her. "I'm so sorry," she said, her cheeks flushing. "I don't know what happened. I just sat down for a moment and—" "You needed the rest," I said gently, setting the tray on the coffee table. "Max has a knack for knowing when someone needs comfort. That's why he's such a good therapy dog." Veronica looked down at the sleeping dog with wonder. "He's remarkable. It's been years since I've felt so peaceful." She accepted a cup of tea, her hands trembling slightly. After a few sips, she seemed to regain her composure. "I've been working on something," she said hesitantly. "A proposal for the committee." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. Inside was a meticulously researched plan for a neighborhood pet registration program. not to restrict or control pet ownership, but to create a community resource in case of emergencies. If we have a central record of all pets in the neighborhood, with photos and medical information, we can act quickly if there's a fire or natural disaster, she explained, growing more animated as she showed us the forms she'd designed. And for elderly residents who might be hospitalized, we could ensure their pets are properly cared for until they recover. I was stunned by the thoughtfulness of the proposal and its complete inversion of her former approach to pets in the community. "Veronica, this is brilliant. There's more," she said, turning to another section of her proposal. "I've researched grants for community pet amenities. We could add pet waste stations throughout the neighborhood, maybe even a small shelter partnership for community adoption events." The passion in her voice was unmistakable. This wasn't just about making amends. She had found a genuine calling in creating systems that helped rather than hindered. The three of us spent the next hour refining her proposal, with Max eventually waking up to join the discussion in his own way, moving from person to person for attention as we talked. By the time Veronica left, she had a solid plan to present at the next committee meeting and a standing invitation to join Max and me on our evening walks. "I think you've made a friend for life," Carla observed after Veronica drove away. "Both of you," she added, scratching Max behind the ears. "Sometimes the people who seem most opposed to change are the ones who need it most," I replied thoughtfully. "They just need someone to show them a different way forward." September brought the first neighborhood-wide vote on the newly revised HOA bylaws. The community center was packed as Walter, serving as interim HOA president, presented the streamlined rules to the residents. "These guidelines represent a new approach to community living," he explained from the podium. "They focus on the core principles that protect our neighborhood's safety and value, while removing unnecessary restrictions that impeded personal freedom and stifled community spirit." The vote was nearly unanimous in favor of adoption, with only 3 residents voting against the changes. As people filed out of the meeting, there was a palpable sense of collective accomplishment. We had transformed not just our rules, but our entire approach to living together. Outside, as neighbors chatted in small groups before heading home, Diana approached me with a small gift bag. "The girls and I wanted to thank you for everything you've done," she said, her eyes shining. "You changed our lives here, Ollie." Inside the bag was a framed photograph of Max surrounded by Diana's daughters and several other neighborhood children at the dog park dedication. Below the photo was a quote in childish handwriting. "Sometimes one dog can change everything." I blinked back unexpected tears as I thanked Diana and the girls for the thoughtful gift. It wasn't just Max, of course. It had taken an entire community coming together to create real change. But it had all started with one simple stand: my refusal to give up my dog. As we walked home that evening, Max and I were joined by Walter, Carla, Bernard, Martha, and even Veronica, a small procession of neighbors who had become friends through our shared journey. "The county task force is making good progress," I told them as we walked. "Several other HOAs are already adopting some of our recommendations, especially around pet policies and appeal procedures." "It's remarkable how far the ripples can spread from one small stone thrown in the water," Walter observed wisely. We reached my house, but no one seemed ready for the evening to end. Without discussion, we all gravitated to my backyard, where the fire pit I'd installed the previous weekend stood ready for its first use. Within minutes, Bernard had a cheerful fire going. Martha produced a bag of marshmallows from her purse. I always keep them handy for the grandchildren. And Carla ducked home to return with a bottle of wine and extra glasses. As darkness fell, we sat around the fire, sharing stories and plans for the neighborhood's future. Diana texted that she'd put the girls to bed and was joining us, bringing leftover cookies from the meeting. More neighbors noticed the gathering and drifted over, until my modest backyard was filled with the gentle murmur of a conversation and occasional bursts of laughter. Max moved contentedly from person to person, receiving affection from everyone, but always returning to lie at my feet, as if to remind me that he was still my dog first and the neighborhood's beloved mascot second. Looking around at the warm faces illuminated by firelight, people who had been strangers just months ago, I felt a profound sense of belonging. This was what community was supposed to be, not a collection of rules and restrictions, but a network of people who cared for and supported one another. "I'd like to propose a toast," Walter said, raising his glass, "to Sycamore Heights, where we've learned that good fences don't necessarily make good neighbors, but good neighbors definitely make a good neighborhood." "To Sycamore Heights," everyone echoed, glasses raised to the star-filled sky. Max raised his head at the chorus of voices, his tail thumping happily against the ground. As far as new beginnings went, this one wasn't just pretty perfect, it was transformative in ways I never could have imagined when I first moved in. And it had all started with one simple, non-negotiable truth. Max was staying with me, HOA rules or not. In the flickering firelight, surrounded by new friends and with my faithful dog by my side, component placement. I silently thanked whatever twist of fate had brought us to this neighborhood at exactly the right time to spark a revolution of kindness and community, one golden retriever at a time. 1 year later. The autumn leaves crunched beneath my feet as Max and I made our morning rounds through Sycamore Heights. The neighborhood had transformed so completely that newcomers often expressed disbelief when longtime residents shared stories of the Veronica era, as it had come to be known. We paused at the community garden, now a thriving hub of activity even in the cooling weather. Raised beds overflowed with fall vegetables, kale, carrots, and pumpkins grown by residents of all ages. The garden shed, painted in cheerful colors by Diana's daughters and their friends, housed shared tools and featured a community bulletin board covered with photos, recipes, and garden tips. "Morning, Ollie. Morning, Max," called Bernard from where he was harvesting the last of his tomatoes. At 82, he had become the unofficial garden mentor, sharing his decades of gardening wisdom with anyone interested. Several children followed him around each weekend, hanging on his every word as he explained the mysteries of composting or the secret to sweet carrots. "Big day today," Bernard said, wiping his hands on his overalls as he approached. "Nervous?" I smiled, scratching Max behind the ears. "A little. It's a big responsibility." Bernard clapped me on the shoulder. "You'll do fine. Couldn't ask for a better HOA president. After all, you're the one who showed us what this place could really be." We continued our walk, stopping at the playground where Max's corner had expanded to include agility equipment for dogs and their owners to enjoy together. A schedule posted on a nearby bulletin board showed weekly dog training classes, now led by Veronica of all people, who had discovered a passion for animal welfare and completed a certification in dog training. As if thinking of her had conjured her presence, Veronica's blue hatchback pulled up alongside us. She had traded in her Mercedes 6 months ago, claiming the smaller car was more practical for transporting dog food and garden supplies. "Perfect timing," she called, getting out with a large cardboard box. "The new pet emergency kits arrived. Would you mind helping me distribute them later?" The pet emergency kits had been Veronica's brainchild, waterproof containers with essential supplies for each pet in the neighborhood in case of evacuation or disaster. Each one was personalized with the pet's name, photo, and medical information. It was just one of many initiatives that had emerged from what we now called the Community Care Committee, rather than the HOA. "Happy to help," I replied, peering into the box filled with neatly labeled kits. "Did you include Max's favorite treats?" "Bacon-flavored dental chews, of course," she replied, producing a special bag from her pocket and offering one to Max, who accepted it with dignified gratitude. Watching Veronica with Max never ceased to amaze me. The woman who had once tried to have him removed from the neighborhood now carried treats in her pockets and volunteered at the county animal shelter every Saturday. People could change. Sometimes they just needed someone to believe they could be better. My phone chimed with a text from Commissioner Chen. County Council unanimously approved the HOA Best Practices recommendations. Congratulations to you and the entire task force. I showed the message to Veronica, whose face lit up with genuine pleasure. That's wonderful. All those months of work really paid off. The recommendations, based largely on the transformation we'd achieved in Sycamore Heights, would now serve as guidelines for HOAs throughout the county. Rules about transparency, appeals processes, and reasonable accommodations would protect homeowners from the kind of abuses we had once suffered. We should celebrate, Veronica said. Maybe a special announcement at the Fall Festival tomorrow? The Sycamore Heights Fall Festival had become our largest community event, replacing the former sterile annual HOA meeting with a day of food, games, and connection. Last year, over 200 residents had attended, including people from neighboring communities who had heard about our transformation and wanted to learn from our example. As Veronica headed off to deliver pet kits to the eastern side of the neighborhood, Max and I continued toward home, passing Walter's house on the way. His front yard, once restricted to a perfectly manicured lawn, now featured an elaborate vegetable garden and a small free library he had built with help from neighborhood children. Walter himself was on his knees, showing Diana's daughters how to plant bulbs for spring flowers. "They'll sleep all winter under the ground," he explained patiently, "and then when the weather warms up, they'll surprise us with beautiful colors." "Like magic," Emma exclaimed, carefully placing a bulb in the small hole Walter had dug. "Nature's magic," Walter agreed with a smile, looking up to wave at Max and me. "Don't forget, board meeting at my place tonight. I'm making my famous chili." Our monthly HOA board meetings had evolved from formal adversarial affairs into collaborative gatherings that felt more like dinner parties. We still handled neighborhood business, budgets, maintenance issues, community projects, but we did it over food and drinks, with an atmosphere of shared purpose rather than hierarchical control. As Max and I approached our house, I noticed a moving truck parked in front of the empty property across the street. A young couple was directing movers carrying furniture, while a small boy of about 5 clutched a leash attached to an enthusiastic beagle puppy. I crossed the street to introduce myself, with Max following at my side. "Welcome to Sycamore Heights," I said warmly. "I'm Oliver Bennett, and this is Max." The couple introduced themselves as Michael and Sarah Chen, explaining they had moved for Michael's new job at the hospital. Their son, Ethan, shyly held out his hand for Max to sniff, while the beagle puppy strained at the leash, eager to make a new friend. "That's Rocket," Ethan explained, his initial shyness fading as he talked about his dog. "He's still learning how to be good, but he tries really hard." "Max would be happy to show Rocket around the neighborhood," I offered. "There's a great dog park just down the street, and we have training classes every Saturday morning." Sarah looked relieved. "That would be wonderful. We were a bit worried about moving with a puppy. Our last neighborhood had so many restrictions about pets." "You don't need to worry about that here," I assured them. "Sycamore Heights is very pet-friendly. In fact, we're having our fall festival tomorrow. It would be a perfect way for you to meet everyone." As I helped the Chen family get oriented to their new home, I couldn't help reflecting on how different their welcome was from mine a year ago. No threatening notices, no immediate fines, no fear, just open arms and an invitation to become part of something special. Later that evening, as the board meeting at Walter's wrapped up and neighbors lingered over dessert and coffee, I found myself on the back porch with Carla and Walter, watching Max play with Diana's daughters in the yard. "I got a call from that reporter today," Carla mentioned, "the one from the local newspaper. She wants to do a follow-up story on our neighborhood revolution, as she calls it, 1 year later and all that." Walter chuckled. "What did you tell her?" "I said she should talk to Ollie," Carla replied, glancing at me. "After all, it all started with him and Max." I shook my head. "It started with one small stand, but it took all of us to create real change. No one person could have transformed Sycamore Heights alone." "True," Walter agreed, "but sometimes all it takes is one person brave enough to say, 'This isn't right,' to give everyone else the courage to speak up too. Inside, someone had started playing music, and through the open window came the sound of laughter and conversation. Bernard was teaching Michael Chen his secret chili recipe. Veronica was showing Sarah the community calendar, while Ethan and Rocket were making fast friends with Diana's daughters. "You know," Carla said thoughtfully, "I lived here for 15 years before last summer, and I knew almost no one's name. Now I can't walk to my mailbox without stopping for at least 3 conversations." "That's the real miracle of what happened here," Walter added. "Not just fixing broken rules, but healing a broken community." As the evening drew to a close and neighbors began to head home, Walter pulled me aside. "I've been meaning to give you something," he said, retrieving a small wrapped package from inside. "Consider it a congratulations gift for your new role as president." Inside was a beautifully carved wooden plaque. Embedded in the polished wood was a photograph of Max from the day of our confrontation with Veronica at the HOA meeting, sitting proudly in his therapy dog vest. Below the photo were engraved words: "Never doubt that one individual with courage can change a community, and sometimes that individual has 4 paws." I ran my fingers over the smooth wood, emotion catching in my throat. "Walter, this is beautiful." The old man smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "A reminder of where it all began, for the days when being president feels overwhelming. Which it will, trust me." On the walk home, the streets of Sycamore Heights glowed warmly with porch lights and the occasional glimpse through windows of families gathered together. The same houses that had once felt like sterile, isolated fortresses now radiated life and connection. Max trotted beside me, occasionally stopping to investigate an interesting scent or to accept a pat from a passing neighbor. As we reached our front porch, I sat on the steps for a moment, Max settling beside me with his head on my knee. The cool autumn air carried the scent of fall leaves and someone's fireplace. In the distance, I could hear the sound of children laughing, probably the teenagers who hung out at the community center on Friday nights, another new tradition that had emerged in our transformed neighborhood. I thought about the Chen family and how different their experience would be from mine. They would never know the fear of opening their mailbox to find violation notices or the anxiety of watching their every move for potential rule infractions. Instead, they would know the embrace of a community that valued connection over control, compassion over compliance. Tomorrow, at the Fall Festival, I would officially accept the role of HOA president, a position I had never sought but now embraced as an opportunity to sustain and build upon the positive changes we had created together. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man who had once been the HOA's most vocal critic was now its leader. But this wasn't the same HOA that had declared war on my dog. This was something new. A true community association focused on enhancing life for all residents rather than policing their behavior. We had even discussed changing the name to better reflect this new reality, though tradition had ultimately won out. Perhaps it was better this way, a reminder of how far we had come and how vigilant we needed to remain. As if sensing my thoughts, Max nuzzled his nose against my hand, his warm eyes looking up at me with that uncanny wisdom that had made him such a perfect therapy dog. I scratched behind his ears, earning a contented sigh. "You know, buddy," I whispered, "when we moved here, all I wanted was a quiet place to live where I could keep my dog in peace. I never imagined we'd end up changing an entire community." Max's tail thumped against the porch steps, his simple happiness a reminder of what truly mattered in life: connection, compassion, and the courage to stand up for both. The stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky above Sycamore Heights. From somewhere down the street came the sound of a guitar and voices singing together, probably the music group that met at the Rodriguez house on Friday nights. I thought about Veronica, who would be teaching her dog training class tomorrow morning before the festival. About Walter, who had found new purpose sharing his lifetime of knowledge with younger generations. About Carla, who had emerged from isolation to become one of our most connected community leaders. About Diana's daughters, growing up in a neighborhood where they were cherished rather than controlled. And I thought about Max, my loyal companion whose presence had catalyzed not just my stand against unfair rules, but a complete reimagining of what a neighborhood could be. As we finally went inside, I paused in the doorway, looking back at the peaceful street. The lessons of Sycamore Heights seemed more important than ever in our divided world. That rules should serve people, not control them. That community is built through connection, not conformity, and that sometimes the most transformative change begins with one simple act of standing up for what's right. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and responsibilities. But tonight, as Max settled into his bed and I prepared for sleep, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought us here, from being unwelcome outsiders to the heart of a thriving community. The story of the HOA Karen and my dog had become neighborhood legend, shared with each new resident as part of their welcome. But the real story wasn't about conflict, it was about transformation. About how one stand against injustice had sparked a revolution of kindness that continued to ripple outward in ways I could never have imagined. As I drifted off to sleep, Max's gentle snoring a familiar comfort in the darkness, I knew that our journey was far from over. There would be new residents to welcome, new challenges to face, new opportunities to strengthen the bonds we had formed. But whatever came next, the foundation had been laid for something beautiful and lasting, a true community where neighbors became friends, where differences were celebrated rather than controlled, and where one golden retriever had shown an entire neighborhood what it meant to lead with love rather than fear. In the quiet of that autumn night, as Sycamore Heights slept peacefully around us, I realized that the greatest victory wasn't winning the fight against an unjust HOA.